My name is Mina. I have given a few talks about Sass before, and I also have been helping to keep Chris sane by helping him organize this thing a little bit. So forgive me if I seem a little jittery. What I'm going to do today is there we go. Basically, what I'm going to do is smack some sass into you. I'm going to teach you how to smack your sass up. Like I said, my name is Mina. This is my handle on Twitter and pretty much all over the internet. So if you want to talk, look me up there. I also started the Dallas chapter of Girl Develop It, which Chirag talked about earlier today. So we're always looking for teachers, students, sponsors. So if you're interested in at all, come find me. I love talking about it. But what I want to talk to you today is about modular CSS architecture and how Sass can help you streamline that process. And this conversation that I had with my boss sort of started this whole journey to the methodology I'm about to teach you. And it went something like this. He said, you remember that site we did for that one client? Anyway, you remember that site we did for that one client who, I need you to turn that into a demo site for 2 more clients and so we can present to somebody else. It's like, sure, I can do that, no problem. It's like, oh, by the way, I need that in 2 days. It's like, you need 2 sites in 2 days? No, not really gonna happen. And he said, well, what's the problem? You just change some colors and some fonts and, CSS is easy, like, what's the big deal? And yeah. CSS is easy. Show of hands, is anybody in this room, like, how many of you think CSS is easy? The exit is that way? I'm kidding. CSS is not really that easy. It's actually kind of hard. No, it's kind of really hard, actually, because you have all these styles and these classes and IDs, and it looks one way in Chrome and another way in Firefox, and IDs all fuck you, and why the hell won't this thing style? You know what? Just use important, because really, just screw it. Actually, CSS is kind of bullshit, but it really doesn't need to be this way. Modular CSS is a way of thinking about your sites not as pages or even as a site, but as individual components. And it's a methodology that helps you to break your sites down to make them fast, not only faster and easier to maintain, but easily portable between systems so that you can really speed up your process. I think Dave Rupert kind of described what modular CSS is pretty well. It's focusing on creating front-end modules instead of complete pages so you can break down complex layouts into reusable solutions. So let's take a site that you've probably seen before, the Apple site. This is a typical homepage for apple.com. And if you broke this down into individual modules, you would see that they have a big sort of header, hero image, they have navigation at the top, a couple of promo things, and then some links at the bottom. And so this is an example of breaking a complete layout down into small pieces, making them independent of each other so they're very easily portable between systems. Examples of what a module might be are navigation and tabs and buttons, breadcrumbs, lists, drop-downs, basically what Dave Rupert calls tiny bootstraps. An example of breaking something down into a module would be, you can see buttons here, tabs, there's a header bar, some pagination, and you can kind of start to see how all of those things would combine to be one whole layout and one whole site. By the way, I'm going to use the words map, module, pattern, component kind of interchangeably. They all basically mean the same thing. It's a set of self-contained styles that work around one specific element on the page. Now, there's a lot of different methodologies that you can use to accomplish this goal. There's MV CSS, BEM, OCSS, Suit, and Intuit. But I'm going to talk to you about SMACSS. And SMACSS stands for Scalable Modular Architecture for CSS. It was created by Jonathan Snook, who used to work at Yahoo. I believe he now works at Shopify. And his goal was to increase the semantic value of the HTML by decoupling the styling and the interaction from the HTML, so these were completely independent of each other. SMACSS is not a framework. A lot of people get that misconstrued. It's basically it's an approach to authoring your style sheets. It doesn't force you to think in a certain way or do things in a certain way. You can easily ignore one part of it and still implement the other parts. There are three basic components to what SMACSS does. It is a way of categorizing your styles, naming conventions of those categorized styles, and then something that Jonathan Snook calls depth of applicability. Now, the categorization of SMACSS styles kind of go as follows. They are 5 separate categories: the base styles, layout styles, modules, states, and themes. Base styles are the bare minimum. They're the element tags themselves, the HTML body tags, the H1 tags, CSS resets, but anything that is consistent all across the site. Next, you have a layout, your layout modules, which consist of the grid system and any major defining sections of your site, like the header, the footer, the sidebar, things like that. Going back to the Apple example I showed you, this is breaking down the basic layout modules of the Apple site. We have the header at the top, footer at the bottom, and then a very large content area. I probably could have abstracted that out even more and say there's a layout section, separate those 2 layout sections into like a main and a sub content, but you get the idea. Next, you have the modules. This is where you write the bulk of the CSS. This is where everything lives. It's content patterns, so things like the navigation, content boxes, promo boxes, search boxes, things like that. Again, going back to the Apple, you can see I've broken it down even further. I have the navigation inside the header, a hero image, a few promo modules, and then a link list and footer text. Jonathan also talks about breaking your modules down into various states. An example of a state would be the active state or the disabled state. In the case of a drop-down menu, the collapse versus the hidden state, or expanded state, excuse me. And he suggests that you put these into a separate, there's a separate naming convention and a separate way of handling these, but I'm going to show you how Sass can actually eliminate that and make it a little bit easier. And lastly, there's the themes, which doesn't always apply to most sites, but it's the module itself in various different contexts. And a good example of this would just be a new skinning of a different site. This is Jessica Hitch's site, and with the normal layout and then the crazy teenage girl layout. So those styles that change the styling of it would be in another set of categorization called called themes. Now I'm going to get into the naming convention that SMACSS uses. For the base styles, it's pretty simple, just the actual element tags, nothing fancy here, H1s, P tags, things like that. For the layout, he suggests using either .layout as a prefix, or I like to shorten it with .l as a prefix for any layout styles. The module, basically just name it something that makes sense. Name it whatever content is you're trying to style. If you want to do a button, use a button, .nav, or whatever that actual module pertains to. Also, there are sub-modules. So say you have a button and you want it to style the secondary state. You would just name it, prefix it with the module, and then whatever that secondary sub-state should be. For state, he suggests you would do a .is as a prefix, so you say .is active, .is expanded, things like that. And lastly, he suggests namespacing .theme for all the theme styles, but this is where I'm going to disagree with him because I don't like the idea of having to do .theme every time I want to change a color for a particular client. So I'll show you later on how Sass can make this a little bit easier. And last part of the SMACSS methodology is something he calls depth of applicability. And it took me a while to get this concept, but basically, you can see this is a selector from hell. And full disclosure, I didn't make this up. This is actually something I wrote like a year ago, so try not to judge me. But this is the HTML structure of that selector. You can see it's very deeply tied to the HTML tree. If I change anything in that HTML structure, that selector is going to also change because it will no longer apply. It goes down what he calls 10 generations. So basically, every time you nest something in the HTML structure, you deeply tie that selector to that structure. The whole point of the depth of applicability is to limit how deeply you go into that tree to style the element you're trying to get to. So back to this selector. What I really wanted was just the anchor tag. There was no reason to go that deeply into it. So using what we just learned about the SMACSS methodology, I could just easily put a style on this that says navigation sub-item and achieve the exact same goal with far less chains of selectors. He also suggests using child selectors, but using them sparingly and only within modules themselves, because usually within a module, the HTML structure itself might not change in that specific module. It's just more all across the site that things will start to get a little hairy. So to recap how you can limit your depth of applicability, use the naming conventions, first of all, that Jonathan suggests. Use class selectors as opposed to actual chaining and whatnot. And also use child selectors, but use them sparingly, and I probably wouldn't go more than just one child deep. To recap what SMACSS is all about, you categorize your CSS into rules and one of the 5 categories that we talked about. You name your modules something meaningful so that you know exactly where to find what you're looking for when it comes time to update these styles. And you try to use as shallow a selector as possible so that you're not deeply tying your styles to the HTML structure. And now it's time for my favorite part, and while you're probably here, it's time to add some Sass to it. Sass was written or created by Hampton Catlin, and it's currently maintained by Chris Epstein and Natalie Weizenbaum. And I say this every talk I get because Hampton, the creator, hates when people capitalize Sass. It's not all caps, it's just title case, so there's no need to shout your acronym at people. Sass can help with namespacing your modules using the naming conventions that SMACSS applies. And you do that by using the ampersand. The ampersand selector in Sass allows you to connect two selectors together in order to output desired effect. An example of this, usually how it's most likely used, is with pseudo-classes, either a hover or an active or a focus state. And if this would output to button : hover. You can also do it with, you can either prepend or append, prepend or append the selectors, and this is what the output of that would look like. Recently, they updated the Sass so that you can now prefix things with a dash or an underscore, which is perfect for the namespacing for module CSS like SMACSS or even BEM or any other of those methodologies. And this will look something like this. In Sass, you can nest a submodule underneath the main module with the dash or the underscore as needed, and when it outputs, it will output into this. A nicely namespaced selector so you can accomplish exactly what you're looking for. Speaking of nesting, I do want to have a little caveat about nesting. Sass is really great in that it lets you nest as deeply as you want to go, but most people like to follow what we call the inception rule, meaning you don't want to go more than 3 levels deep when you nest. Otherwise, you start to end up with that selector from hell that I showed you before, where everything is chained together and it's a nightmare to maintain. So this is an example of nesting one a modifier under a submodule. And this would output to something like this. It's not horribly, it's still nicely namespaced, it makes sense, and it's not a ridiculous chain of selectors. It's still one class. Because of the way that SMACSS works, it adds styles rather than take them away. So every time you do a submodule, you are adding styles to the main module. That means that in order to get a submodule to style it the way you want to, you have to apply the class of both the module and the submodule, which is not a big deal, but I don't like to have what I call classitis going on in my HTML. I like to keep as few classes as possible out of there. So one way that Sass can help you with that is with extends. Extends basically does exactly what it says. You can extend a class inside of another class. So what you can do in this instance is to extend the main module .button inside of the submodule button-large. What happens is that button-large will inherit all the styles of button plus any styles you apply to it. So that way, when you go to add the class in your HTML, you can simply add the class of the submodule and still achieve the same desired effect. Another way you can use extends to your benefit is by using placeholder selectors instead. Now this basically is the same thing as using a regular selector, except when you output the CSS, the placeholder selector will not output it by itself. Before, the output would include dot button and dot button dash large. But if you're never going to have just a button by itself without any submodule, then there's no need to output that style alone. So you can go ahead and you can use a placeholder selector in its place and simply output all the styles you'll need. So it's just one way to kind of keep your CSS file smaller than as small as possible. Again, with all things with Sass, I would say use it sparingly, use it wisely. Don't extend anything between modules, so don't have your modules relying on each other. You just extend within that one particular module. The file structure is also one way that Sass can help you streamline all this process. There's this Sass import that I love, and it's something that is one of the main reasons that I actually use Sass. You can import smaller files into your main Sass file without the danger of a regular CSS import, which is it will hold up the rendering process until it downloads everything else. So what I do when I create my Sass, my SMACSS-based Sass file is that I break everything down first into their utility state. Basically, this would be variables, mix-in functions, anything that if you compiled it, it won't actually output any CSS, just all logic. After that, I import any third-party styles that the rest of my style sheets depended on. So that would be Font Awesome, a third-party grid system if I'm using one, Bootstrap or Foundation if you're using that, any styles that you're going to be using later on that you yourself didn't write. Then you import all of your base styles, the resets, the element styles, things like that. Import the layout modules, the actual grid system, and the major layout components. After that, import the base of your CSS, all of your modules. Import any states that you're using, like active states, collapse states, or any touch-specific states you might be using. Then I like to import the separate font files. When I'm using any sort of web fonts that aren't a third party like Typekit or Google Fonts, I would import them here. Next comes to print styles, and although you can't really see it here, but I actually list print styles under my states folder, but I don't include them until later on in the style sheet because I don't want those styles to break the flow. They don't need to come until later, basically. Now we need to talk about the dirty little secret of CSS, important. In theory, if you do all of what I'm saying as properly as you can, you shouldn't need to use this. But we all know that stuff happens, and you kind of have to make things work when you can. So occasionally, we use this in our style sheets, and then we're all like, OK, I feel ashamed of myself. Well, there is a way to help that as well. Basically, Harry Roberts came up with something called shame.css, which I think is a brilliant idea. And the principle of this is anything that you know is a hack, that you know shouldn't be there and you should do it better, you stick it in this file so that way all of the hacks live together and it's easy for you to come back and fix it later as opposed to putting it in your main style sheet and losing it and it never gets fixed. With Sass, I would go ahead and switch that to shame.scss so that way you can import it as a partial at the end of your file, and it won't output a separate CSS file. And that goes at the very bottom because, sometimes hacks happen. And I know this is like a long list of files. It seems like a very complicated file structure or just a lot of files to deal with, but the purpose of it is to keep your CSS as small and readable as possible so that way you know exactly where to find what you're looking for when it comes time to update anything. And don't worry about trying to write all that down too quickly because I actually did most of the work for you. I have open sourced a boilerplate that follows the exact it follows the file structure that I just showed you. It's called Sassy Starter. You can find it at mina.so/Sassy Starter. And feel free to fork it, download it, do whatever you want to it. The last thing I want to talk about is theming. As I said before, Jonathan Snook suggests doing dot theme to prepend all of your themes, but I think if you use this mix-in instead, it allows you to include theme-specific styles inside of your main modules and your Sass files instead of in a separate style sheet entirely. I like to keep everything related to one module and it's one spot so that way there's no jumping around finding different things. This is what the mix-in looks like. Basically, it's saying you name what the theme is, and it has a conditional. If the variable theme is equal to whatever the name is, output the content for that particular theme. So let's say, for example, you have a theme called Rebecca Purple. You would set the variable to Rebecca Purple, and then once it finds, you would include the theme Rebecca Purple inside of your module, and then any styles it finds underneath that, it would include in your output as Sass file, or CSS file. I do want to do one little disclaimer about that, though. The way it works now, at least in my boilerplate, is that it also outputs all of the default styles in addition to the theme files. So it kind of makes your style sheet a little bit bigger than necessary, but I am working on a way to solve that problem, so I guess I will keep you posted. Now, I know you're thinking this is all well and good, and this is like wonderful news, but who actually has time to do all this stuff? I got stuff to do, I got jobs, I got projects, like no one has time to do all of that. And to that I say, just refactor refactor things. There's no need to, I'm not telling you to revamp your entire project, just pick a little module, maybe a navigation module, and try to apply some of these styles and see how that works out for you. Okay, that sounds good, but have you seen my CSS files? Like, there's just no way that that's gonna work out well for me. So do I really need to refactor anything? Again, to that I say, baby steps. Just find one module, create some variables around it, apply the naming conventions I talked about, and then use nesting and extending when necessary. To give you an example of how this works out well for you, I took that horrible selector I showed you before, and I abstracted it out and showed you how the before and after of applying everything I talked about in this talk. Again, it's mina.so/smacks-menu. And you'll see in that example that before, that one module was 161 lines of CSS. And after I applied the SMACSS methodology and all of the Sass tricks I showed you, I got it down to 97 lines of CSS. And that's one module. So you can kind of imagine how much you can save if you kind of apply this to your entire project. So now, to recap everything I talked about, because I know it's almost lunchtime and I'm keeping you from it, if you namespace with ampersands and extends, break your modules down into partials so that you can easily import bits and pieces, and refactor into chunks, you can save yourself a lot of time in the long run. A couple of resources to help you get started. Of course, the actual book, SMACSS, written by Jonathan Snook. It's pretty cheap ebook. I would suggest you all buy it, read it. It's a quick read. Sorry, you can't read that. It's smacks.com. Again, I think it's like 15 bucks, and it's a quick read, and it's really valuable. The actual Sass documentation, it's sass-lang.com. If you are not familiar with Sass and want to get started, check that out. And also, there's this kind of like JS Ben for Sass, is called Sassmeister. And it's a good way for you to get started playing with Sass without having to go through the process of actually installing Sass in your own system. You can do it online and kind of see how that will work before you decide whether you want to implement it. And now I want to get to one of my favorite parts of this particular talk is I'm going to give stuff away. So I hope you were paying attention, because I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and whoever can answer them will get some things from me. We are having there's a new web development conference coming in March. It's called Squares Conference, and the curator told me that I can give away a few tickets to that. I'm also doing a Sass workshop at Squares Conference, so if you want to learn more about Sass, you can sign up for the workshop. So I'm going to give away 2 tickets to the conference and a workshop to people who could answer these 3 questions. First of all, first hand I can see, who created SMACSS? SMACSS. I'll let you have it. Okay. Okay. First hand, who created Sass? Really? Nobody? Say it again? Yes, Hampton Caitlin, excuse me. And finally, Who can name one of the current developers in Sass? All right, you guys got 2 tickets and 1 conference ticket. So come find me later and I'll tell you how to collect them. And that is all. There's a list of my slides, and my name is Mina. And thank you for listening.